When Francisco de Zurbarán's portrayal of Saint Serapion appeared at the National Gallery's 2010 exhibition, The Sacred Made Real, the Dutch essayist Kees Nootboom noticed how visitors moved silently around the painting, as if they found it impossible to pull their eyes away from the image of an exhausted dead man finally allowed to sleep. In Nootboom's own words, Zurbarán had created a temporal journey into the quintessential other, an encounter capable of changing the viewer in many and unknown ways. The power of this image has been recognised ever since it was completed for the Mercedarian convent of Seville in 1628, where it is believed to have hung in the Sala de Profundis, a room reserved for the bodies of deceased brethren before their burial. Here in the Mercedarian convent, it contributed to Zurbarán's success in winning a number of major commissions, requiring his workshop to move from Extremadura to Seville and launching arguably the most successful period of his career. The subject of the canvas, the British Mercedarian proto-martyr Peter Serapion, was a relatively obscure figure before the early 17th century, lacking an agreed hagiography and without a previously established iconographic representation. Even after Serapion's eventual canonization in 1728, the saint never achieved a following beyond the specific interests of the Mercedarian order. The modern reception of this painting cannot therefore be attributed to a historically based affinity with Serapion and his attributes, or even an emotional reaction to the method of his martyrdom, which Zurbarán has consciously avoided revealing in this depiction. The power of this image must therefore be located outside the scope of the narrative aspects of the painting. Much of the existing writing on this image has tended to focus on the purely visual effects that Zurbarán was able to conjure, and the extent to which they support explicitly historicising concerns, such as Zurbarán's perceived empathy with the spirituality of his Mercedarian clients. By contrast, relatively little attention has been given to the work's effective nature, or the tools that Zurbarán used to lead viewers such as Nootboom to experience the existential impact of seeing a man portrayed at the point of death. The task of this brief paper is therefore to look at St. Serapion afresh, both examining the historical circumstances of its creation and Zurbarán's treatment of the Serapion legend, and also considering the nature of its effective agency, exploring how Zurbarán's use of visual devices, such as the Mercedarian habit and the saint's facial expression and bound hands, raise questions within the beholder, questions around the nature of pain and suffering and its role in defining the viewer's experience, questions that were relevant to a Mercedarian audience and continue to unsettle the modern mind today. Turning first to the legend of Serapion, most accounts of the saint's life agree that he was born in London in 1178. His family was noble, and as a young man he is said to have accompanied King Richard I on the Third Crusade. On winning his freedom after a period of imprisonment, the martyrology proclaims that he was eager to give his life as a gift of faith, and so he travelled to Spain, serving King Alfonso VIII in his campaigns in Castile and Andalusia. It was during his period in Spain that he first encountered Peter Nolasco, who was in the process of establishing a new religious order dedicated to ransoming Christians that had been taken captive in Islamic Spain and North Africa, and Serapion entered the novitiate of the new Mercedarian order in 1222. In these accounts, the earliest of which appear almost 400 years after his death, there are various distinctly apocryphal stories concerning Serapion's deeds and virtues. Most importantly for Zurbarán's portrayal of the saint, there are multiple accounts of how he met his death in 1240. The Roman martyrology asserts that he was taken hostage in Algiers while ransoming captive Christians. Serapion's companion returned to Barcelona to raise funds to pay for his release. However, the money could not be found in time, and Serapion was crucified on a saltire in the manner of St. Andrew, following which he was disemboweled and dismembered. Other accounts of his death in Algiers claim he underwent a series of torments before death, his body being torn with metal talons, burnt with brimstone, racked and mutilated, before finally being disemboweled with his intestines wound around a windlass in the manner of St. Erasmus. Lastly, a rather different version of events was recorded by the friar Alonso Remon, who in his 1618 History of the Mercedarian Order claimed that Serapion was taken prisoner by English pirates while visiting Scotland, and bound by his hands and feet to two poles, he was beaten, dismembered, and disemboweled. Finally, his neck was severed, leaving his head to dangle. While the veracity of each of these narratives remains hard to substantiate, what they establish is a picture of Serapion meeting a violent death, imbued with imagery drawing on forms of torture, disembowelment, and crucifixion. A death that was intended to connect Serapion with the suffering of both St. Andrew and St. Erasmus, and ultimately to associate him with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. As with the legend of Serapion, the painting itself lacks a neat evidential background. Unlike Zurbarán's other works for the Mercedarian Order, research has yet to find a contract or commissioning documentation for this painting. The only evidence is visual, the cartouche that appears pinned to the lower right-hand side of the canvas, asserting Zurbarán's authorship and the year of its production, 1628. In the absence of historical and contextual evidence, much of the recent scholarship has focused on the various Serapion narratives and the iconographical readings of Zurbarán's image that emerge from them. Jonathan Brown, Odile de Lender and Xavier Bray have all focused on Remon's 1618 account, relying heavily on the mention of Serapion's partially severed neck to explain the bowed head of Serapion's figure. Yet given the near total absence of cuts, blood or other marks denoting the cause of Serapion's demise, the visual evidence does not wholly agree with any of the written accounts of his martyrdom. It is of course possible that Zurbarán and the Mercedarians involved with this painting knew one or more of these stories, and the decision to create an image that defies a transparent explanation of Serapion's martyrdom was a deliberate attempt to negotiate the vagaries of the historical record. Yet the viewer today, confronted with the obscurity of both Serapion's life and the circumstances of this commission, must proceed with caution in relying on any one literary source. I would suggest a more productive approach would be to keep an open mind concerning the literary evidence and shift the focus towards the visual evidence in order to arrive at a richer reading of Zurbarán's undoubtedly complex image. Turning to the image itself, possibly the most startling aspect of the composition is Zurbarán's depiction of Serapion's Mercedarian habit. Occupying nearly 2/3 of the canvas, Xavier Bray refers to it as a tour de force of painting, endowing Serapion with a physicality and grandeur that belie his broken body. Zurbarán creates this impact through a number of techniques that would become typical of the early part of his career in Seville. First, and perhaps most notable, is his extensive use of light and shadow to give the appearance of weight and volume. Zurbarán constructs the habit through a cascade of deep folds. The wave of heavy ivory material is accentuated by both the warmth of the light and the deep shadows that it casts. A use of light designed to accentuate the tactile quality of the material and to draw in the viewer to consider the immense weight of the garment bearing down on a fragile body. An almost stifling sensation that allows the viewer their first entry point into Serapion's pain. The Mercedarian habit also allows Zurbarán to reveal his extraordinary facility for painting with multiple shades of white, using the folds and recesses of the white material to communicate the essence of Serapion's broken body. Where a gap appears between the scapula and the cowl, Zurbarán allows a glimpse of the saint's form. The pleats of his tunic gather together by the tight embrace of a dark-coloured belt around his clearly slender waist. Like the cords that bind his hands, the belt appears to be holding Serapion in place, taking up the slack of fabric that would otherwise dissipate with his corpse. Zurbarán, in allowing the heavy white habit to consume so much of the canvas, is not creating a cover for Serapion suffering, but an all-consuming second skin that is fused to a body in pain. Within the deep swirling ridges of the crumpled cowl and the creases at the centre of the scapula, Zurbarán provides clues as to the disemboweled mess that lies beneath. While it might be tempting to see this habit containing a premonition of Serapion's funeral pall and ultimately his heavenly body made whole again following a martyr's death, a more urgent task for the white cloth is to cover and obliterate the wounds of his martyrdom, just as in serious pain the claims of the body nullify the claims of the world. To understand the totality of the experience that Zurbarán portrays, it is necessary to consider our relationship to pain. Elaine Scarry's book, The Body in Pain, examines the impact of torture on a victim's body and mind. Scarry describes how both the torturer and every aspect of the victim's environment come to be associated with the act of inflicting pain. From the modern torturer's cattle prod to the cold concrete floor of the torture room, pain becomes the totality of the victim's world. Being unable to hold pain in a single place, to give it a name or see its burden shared by acts of sympathy, there is nothing, Scarry asserts, that counteracts the force by which a person in great pain or sickness can be swallowed alive by the body. In Serapion's case, the tendency has been only to see the absence of the expected visible signs of torture, the absence of wounds and blood. Yet Serapion has reached the point of death, the moment when the pain of his torture will consume his very existence. It is at this moment that Serapion's habit, like the ropes and the wood to which he is tied, will become a participant in the demise of the body it covers. It should be noted that this is not the first time that Zurbarán has endowed drapery with such power. Jonathan Brown, in discussing Zurbarán's painting of Christ's loincloth in the San Pablo crucifixion, painted the year before Serapion, argues that Zurbarán's blending of uncanny realism and majestic abstraction reinterprets Christ as both lifelike and greater than life. If the San Pablo loincloth is a first sign of the power that can be given to the modelling of a simple white piece of fabric, then Serapion's all-consuming habit is surely the continuation of this argument, as Zurbarán explores the power of such strongly drawn drapery, both in the beholder and to convey complex ontological truths. Looking beyond the white habit, for a saint that has met such a violent death, there is a notable absence of blood in this image. In fact, the only red pigment that appears to touch Serapion's skin is the small amount of carmine used to lighten his bottom lip and left eyelid. Instead, Zurbarán reserves the blood-red colour for the Mercedarian insignia attached to Serapion's habit in the very centre of the picture. Looking more closely at the Mercedarian badge, it appears pinned to his habit. The sharp end of the large pin, having pierced the fabric, can be seen in full view protruding from the bottom of the shield. This symbol of Aragon and the cross under which Serapion served has, in the act of piercing an attachment, taken the form of a weapon, the only weapon visible to our eyes, the only instrument to penetrate the cloth of the saint's habit, the metaphor for the broken body beneath. In the failure of language adequately to provide tools for sharing in the sensation of another's pain, it is often the presence of a weapon that gives pain its voice. For example, the important role a weapon plays in our most basic vocabulary for discussing pain, when we speak of knife-like pains, stabbing pains, or a boring headache. This is even more potent when the weapon pierces the body's external boundaries. In this moment, Scarry writes, the body begins to externalize, objectify, and make shareable what is originally an interior and unshareable experience. The sharp end of the insignia's pin prompts viewers to remember their own pain, a moment when their boundary between the inside and outside has been dissolved, allowing for a brief moment to share in Serapion's experience. As Scarry reminds us, what is remembered in the body is well remembered. Beyond the voluminous habit, Zurbarán reveals very little of the saint's physical appearance, other than his bowed head and lifeless hands. Serapion's head hangs forward, resting on his right shoulder. This position is immediately recognizable as the pose of the dead Christ in the St. Pablo crucifixion. In so closely following his own model, Zurbarán's intention must surely have been to recall not only the martyr's spirit of self-sacrifice, but also the means of his death. For Serapion's face, Zurbarán departs from his previous depiction. Rather than a dead Christ, he chooses to paint a man at the very edge of life and death, creating a moment of uncertainty and instability. His eyes are already closed, his lips slightly parted as if to make way for a final breath. His dishevelled hair falls forward, revealing a swollen forehead. Shadows appear to be creeping across his face, with the use of grey pigments to indicate the ebbing of life from his skin. The few patches of brightness at the tip of his nose, on his bottom lip, and on his left eyelid act as a flickering reminder of what is being lost. Scholars have long argued that this naturalistic, unidealized face was created as a study from life. Yet whatever the creative process that enabled Zurbarán to bring such uncanny naturalism to Serapion's face, the more pertinent observation is the skill with which he realized an expression that appears to hover at the liminality of life itself, communicating without perceptible movement an intense serenity as the last colour and breath drains away. The sense of abandonment is reinforced by Serapion's hands, which appear to have already given up the pretence of life. Hanging forward, bent at the wrists, they are only held in place by 3 tight loops of rope around the sleeves of an undershirt, denying us again the sight of any wound. His sleeves appear to be neatly folded back, as if a deliberate act of revelation was intended. The ropes that once constrained Serapion's limbs have now changed their role to become the only support of his spent body, hanging on to its instrument of torture, a body that Jonathan Brown has likened to an unused puppet. While, as noted earlier, there is an absence of models for Serapion's pose, its relation to other representation of martyrs tied by the hand should be considered. Of particular relevance are Ribera's bound figures, which had begun to appear in prints and drawings from the early 1620s onwards. The representation of the bound man became a significant preoccupation for Ribera, as evidenced by the fact that men tied to trees, often shattered tree stumps, are the subject of approximately a quarter of Ribera's extant drawings. In this image of St. Sebastian from the early 1620s, Ribera portrays the saint bound by both hands to a tree with his head bent in the same direction as Serapion. Likewise, in Ribera's highly finished 1624 etching of St. Bartholomew, the apostle's right hand is tied to a tree with 3 loops of rope, its knotted end left to dangle in a similar manner to the cord restraining Serapion's right hand. While it might superficially appear that Zurbarán's lack of interest in depicting the wounds of martyrdom was fundamentally at odds with Ribera's graphic depictions, the theme of the bound man and these poses suggest a deeper engagement, albeit one where Zurbarán achieved with white drapery what Ribera chose to reveal with flesh and skin. In psychoanalytic theory, for an artwork to be seen as effective, the origins of its power should be capable of being traced back to the drives and motions that lie within the human psyche. Effective artworks must therefore speak to those states that rest under the surface of a viewer's consciousness. That this image of St. Serapion has the power to stop viewers in their tracks is beyond doubt. Its verism alone has an arresting quality, causing viewers to marvel at the play of light on the masses of white cloth and the tragic fate of the man whose face feels knowable and in some sense real. Yet if the techniques of the tenebrist were the sum of the painting's appeal, it is hard to imagine that its reputation would have ever reached much beyond the Mercedarian cloister. One reason for the success of Serapion must surely lie in the fundamental questions it raises on how to address the body in pain. the process by which viewers are able to understand and share in the sentience of Serapion's suffering, and Zurbarán's skill at bringing every element of the painted canvas to this task. From the weight and touch of Serapion's habit, to the Mercedarian badge that pierces the cloth, to the shining bright pin that attaches the cartouche to the darkness and allows the real world to intrude on Serapion's pain. Jonathan Brown noted that in this painting, Zurbarán constructed his metaphor of Christian martyrdom with deliberate care. Yet this allusion to early Christian martyrs and ultimately to Christ's death on the cross should not be seen as a negation of the body's claims for value and attention in the world, an emptying of a worthless vessel in the hope of a heavenly goal. I would argue that the opposite holds true. That is, in the act of allowing the body to be in pain, the Christian ascetic or martyr is elevating the body, so that the claims of the world are cancelled, leaving the path clear for the entry of the unworldly and the transcendental. Elaine Scarry argues that for believers, God's most intimate contact with his creatures is his sensory contact with the human body. In the Jewish tradition, this contact is mediated through the weapon of the burning bush, the demands of the law, and God's acts of vengeance on a wayward people. The more radical claim of the Christian tradition is that contact is mediated by Jesus, God taking on human form, and in the centrality of the crucifixion, weaponizing the body itself. In this context, Serapion's likeness to the San Pablo crucifixion is not simply the artist repurposing a successful pictorial strategy from an earlier work, but a shared assertion of the power of a broken body. That in the careful rendering of what we can see and what remains covered, it is this body in pain, a body on the point of reaching its goal, that the image derives the fullness of its power. Working through this pain, viewers are enticed to look at Serapion's face and consider the infection of death in their own lives. This is the ultimate drive that underpins the effective action of Zurbarán's painting, as relevant in the 17th century Sala de Profundis as it is in the art gallery today.